Today, on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Geoff Harper. Dr. Harper serves as a lecturer in Old Testament and Hebrew at Sydney Missionary and Bible College in Australia. His areas of research include biblical exegesis, intertextuality, and the theology of the Hebrew Bible, with a particular focus on the Pentateuch. In this episode, we'll dig into how the Old Testament weaves into the New, what has already been fulfilled in Christ, and which timeless truths continue to shape our faith today. This is going to be a rich and practical conversation for anyone who wants to understand how the Old Testament still speaks into the Christian life. Now it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and joining me all the way from Australia, I have Dr. Geoff Harper with us. Dr. Harper, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight, my time. Today, your time, I believe. But appreciate the time today.
Yeah, no, pleasure to be here just after breakfast time here in Sydney.
All right. So just after breakfast for you, just after dinner for me. So, or at least we ate. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and I guess that's the marvel of the technological world, isn't it? We can talk to each other across time zones.
It is amazing. It really is. It is amazing. Awesome. So let's dive right in over here. So for those who may not be as familiar with your work, can you share a bit about your background and what drew you specifically to Old Testament studies?
Sure, I work in Old Testament studies, in Pentateuch in particular, and I guess even within that, in the book of Leviticus, is where I was drawn many years ago as an undergraduate student, first of all, and then kind of doctoral student, stayed working in Leviticus. And I've just been continually drawn back to that part of the Old Testament over the years. It's occupied lots of my thinking, lots of my research, lots of my publications. Not everything. I do eventually sometimes venture beyond that. But there's just endlessly fascinating questions and things to explore and to bring before students as well. It's a wonderful job to have, to be able to do that.
That's great. So what about Leviticus specifically is like some things that pop out that drew you to that?
Yeah, I think it's just a unique portrait of God and his interactions, I guess, with the people of Israel. And that just opens up a whole wealth of understanding about who God is, what the human problems are, and how God has acted and continues to act to address some of those problems. And you just get this poignant picture of a God who's so committed to his people that he'll do anything in order for that invitation to come and to live with him happens. It's just wonderful.
Yeah.
So it's continually encouraging, just from a completely personal point of view, but just also just fascinating, kind of from an academic, professional point of view as well. There's just endless things to think about.
So many people struggle with seeing the Old Testament as even relevant today. I know this has been a debate back from the church fathers, some of the church fathers of the early church, but even up until today of the how relevant this Old Testament is for us today. So I guess, again, high-end view, and I'm going to ask you maybe some more specific questions about intertextuality and things like that as we go on over here. But why do you believe it still holds so much importance to our modern faith?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and as you say, it's much debated. People have lots of opinions on that. I guess I can tell you a story that might help to illustrate some of that. So one of my students here at the seminary where I teach, he and his wife were invited to read the Bible with a non-Christian couple that they'd met. So they turned to one of the Gospels. They started reading kind of the stories of Jesus and discussing that with the couples. Or with the other couple. But it was fascinating to me that after several weeks of doing that, they realized that the questions that this couple had were so profound, they just weren't making any sense of the Gospels. Like, because here in Australia, it's very much kind of a post-Christian environment. People are very secular. And so they're asking kind of questions like, oh, what is a God? Like,
Wow.
what are we talking about here? There's just kind of no background at all. And so my student realized that actually they're not making any sense here. And maybe we ought to try going back to Genesis 1. And let's start there and read kind of from there onwards. And they did that. And there's obviously still lots of questions. But for them, they noticed that the penny was beginning to drop.
Hmm.
that now this non-Christian couple that they were discussing the truths of the Bible with were kind of getting it. And I think that's such a good illustration of how the value of the Old Testament is not just there with kind of information or history, but it's actually shaping our whole view of the world. It's communicating a worldview, giving us a framework of understanding within which the truths of the gospel now make sense. And
Right.
that was just such a kind of a poignant illustration of that truth, just playing out in a very real situation in a church
Yeah, it's great.
here in Sydney.
That is a great analogy there, and a great story, because that does make sense, right? You read the New Testament, Jesus comes to fulfill the law, not but. Well, what is he fulfilling, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
a lot of his comments are making references to, especially to his audience who are understanding of the law and a lot of the writings of the Old Testament. So that is. I want to just bring up something that you said. I was a little off the cuff about the spiritual state in Australia. You're around the
yeah.
Sydney area, correct? You speak it.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. Yeah, so I'm originally from Ireland. I grew up in Dublin, but
okay.
living here down under in Australia for the last 16 years or so. So two very different cultures, like in some ways similar, both English speaking, kind of Western, post-Christian in various different ways. But here in Australia, kind of a deeply secular culture in which Christianity is still here and still very much a present force, and yet increasingly marginalized. And so I think beginning to notice just people growing up without even the kind of the basics of a Christian understanding, even just kind of simple things like Jesus or the resurrection or Moses, or kind of things you might take for granted that surely everybody knows this,
Yeah.
even at some level. It's just not there at all.
Hmm. Are they open? Are the people open generally?
Yeah, and that's the intriguing thing is that I think a generation ago people were less open because they were kind of deliberately moving away from Christianity, and so often
Okay.
had an axe to grind or kind of negative things to say. But I think increasingly, and I think this is being reflected elsewhere, like in the UK in particular as well, where you have a generation who's grown up with nothing. That suddenly now the claims and the truths of the gospel are fascinating again
Hmm.
because they're new.
Right.
Like I was talking with again another student here at the seminary who was kind of teaching a bunch of kind of children, kind of leading them through kind of the Easter story, or kind of getting towards the Easter story, kind of the story of Jesus as it unfolds. And when Jesus died, but then came back to life again, there was this audible gasp around the room as kind of children discovered and heard something for the very first time. And I was like, the newness and the power of that, I think it's just intriguing in a completely different way.
Oh, that's exciting. That's great.
And so, yeah, lots of great things happening. People coming to faith, people being open in just a way that kind of I think a previous generation maybe wasn't.
Do you think the pushback was more of a moral issue, or more of a theological, or I guess intellectual
Yeah,
issue?
I think probably all of those things or various combinations of those. I don't think there's one particular narrative or story that captures everybody.
Sure.
Kind of just the slow diminishing of interest in Christian things.
Okay.
Very easy replacement with materialism
Sure.
and other things.
Okay. Awesome. All right. All right. Let's get back on track. So I was just, you brought that up. I was just
Yeah,
curious
yeah.
because, we take for granted, especially a lot of my listeners, people at the church, sometimes we get in those bubbles where it's like everybody believes or thinks like us. That everybody's dealing with the same things. So it's great to hear a different
Yeah.
perspective for sure. But all right. So back to the Old Testament. How do you personally approach teaching the Old Testament to help people, I guess, see it as not a like distant history, but as God's living word?
Yeah, lots of ways. It's like I'm teaching kind of first year undergraduate students this year, and in some like my aims as a teacher are to kind of there's content. So they got to wrestle with the book of Isaiah or the book of Genesis or whatever. We've got to talk about content, but
Yeah.
really my high end goal is to awaken a fascination with the Old Testament.
Okay.
I think it is just intriguing. It's fascinating. There's so much to explore. And I think part of that is just because it's an unknown for many people. They've kind of quite a surface level understanding, say, of the book of Genesis or Exodus, to kind of know the Exodus story. And yet there's so much in the detail that's really intriguing. And so trying to awaken that sense of curiosity and fascination, the idea of a kind of exploration of something that's kind of intriguing, wonderful, and yet directly applicable to life.
Sure.
And so, like even in class at times, sometimes you see tears in class,
Oh,
or
wow.
as people kind of get something about who God is and his interaction with his people, or sometimes there's laughter and joy, is kind of they kind of sense something they hadn't sensed before, and so it's to try and awaken that in terms of teaching. Hopefully, that people will just go on into a lifetime of continuing to explore.
Right. There's so much in the Old Testament and so many relatable characters, for lack of a better term, right? Like
Yeah,
you could,
yeah.
sometimes you're David, where you feel like you're ready to take on Goliath, but other times you're David on the roof going, I don't know if I should be looking at this right now.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and so that it raises lots of awkward questions and hard questions and kind of difficult topics, and you think, oh, they're actually good for us to wrestle with.
Yeah.
They're there in the scriptures for a reason. They're preserved for a reason. It's much easier, much more comfortable just to ignore them and pretend those parts of the Bible aren't there, but they are.
Right.
And so we've got to
Yeah.
wrestle with, well, why has God preserved these for us? But what is he saying to us about himself, about his interactions with the world? Maybe what is he saying to us about ourselves and our interactions with one another? There's kind of uncomfortable truths as part of that. And I think maybe the Old Testament confronts us with more of that. Certainly a longer body of work than the New Testament, so there's more content. But I
Yeah.
think some of those pictures are just really graphic, sometimes difficult, and uncomfortable truths that, yeah, if we're honest, sometimes we don't want to see them.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that rawness part of the Bible, because sometimes we paint Christianity as just sunshine and rainbows and flowers all the time. Where we don't even know what to do with ourselves when we deal with, like, terrible things, a loss of a child, divorce, pain, heartbreak, betrayal. And it's just like, but God promised me all these things. It's almost like when you see these, again, biblical figures, these men and women, or that are just like me and you, being used by God in our flaws.
Yeah,
I do think that's encouraging.
yeah, yeah.
You
No,
know,
it really is, and so like it's continually encouraging to see the portraits of, say, the patriarchs like Abraham. You think it's very easy to look at Abraham kind of simplistically and say, oh, a man of faith,
right?
a man who trusted God, who was obedient. You think, oh, that's part of Abraham's story,
Mm,
but it's
Yeah,
not the whole story. And so when you read some of the details, you see, oh, there's far more flaws here. There's far more idiosyncrasies. There's far more doubts. There's far more kind of just wrong-headed actions all the time. And you think, oh, Abraham didn't start as a man of faith, but he became a man of faith. And so there's an act of transformation in Abraham that the stories of Genesis are inviting us to see. That I think it's not then just saying something about Abraham kind of as historical information, but suggestive that this is God's way of interacting with people that he calls to himself, to take them in all of their kind of inherent messiness and kind of lopsidedness and kind of wrongheadedness, whatever that is, but to
yeah,
transform them into a different person,
yeah,
a person that better resembles him. And you think, oh, if God can do that with Abraham, God presumably is still in the same business of changing men and women,
that's
making
it.
them into people who they weren't, but who are now more pleasing to God. And you think, oh, this was just wonderful.
So
There's kind
good.
of these pictures of what God can do and is doing.
So good. It's so good. You've done a significant amount of research on intertextuality. Can you explain what that means to our audience and why it's so vital for understanding the Bible as a whole?
Yeah, essentially, intertextuality is just the use of one text by another author as they write. So it could be spoken speech as well, but we're talking about the Bible, so it's using kind of previous texts, and so it might be uh, language like a quotation, might be something more subtle than that, like an allusion that a later writer is making to a previous work. And so we see it all the time. Like you see it in movies, you see it in Netflix series, you see it kind of in novels that we read, kind of these allusions to kind of famous figures or what they've said, or kind of speeches from the past, or something else that just kind of raises an awareness of they're not just talking about this moment, but they're bringing to bear other moments
Right.
that then enrich what's going on or give it a deeper level of significance or heighten the kind of tension of what's happening by drawing in some of those things. And so the biblical texts do that all the time. We see it clearly, like with the New Testament use of the Old Testament, that becomes really obvious. Maybe less obvious, but still just as present is kind of the Old Testament use of the Old Testament. The kind of later Old Testament books referring backwards, connected to other ones, utilizing that for a whole lot of different means. And so, yeah, I've spent lots of time kind of digging around in that. There's lots of really fascinating things to look at in there that I think just bring another dimension to what the scriptures are doing and the interconnectedness of the Bible as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna ask that question about weaving the old and new together, because the way, again, we teach it or understand it here, right? You have Adam and Eve in the garden. You have the sin coming in. We see the fall of man. We see separation between God and man. And the Old Testament just seems to be like this major overarching story that's culminating in this redemption story that comes in the figure of Jesus Christ. So how does, in your opinion, the Old Testament weave into the New Testament story of Jesus in maybe some ways that are often overlooked? Maybe bring up a couple examples that you have noticed going, this is something cool though, that fascinated me.
Well, let me start with an example. Like, there's lots of ways that the New Testament does that. Some of them, again, like I said, kind of really obvious. So, like, you might like reading Matthew's Gospel. Kind of frequently, Matthew will say something along the lines of, "This happened in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken to," and usually a prophet or something. You think, "Oh, that's made it really clear."
Right.
So it's like a good essay when you read it. Oh, somebody's put it in the footnote. They made it really clear what they're doing. The New Testament writers often just write in a way that just assumes familiarity with the Old Testament. And the kind of working assumption seems to be that the people that they're writing to have saturated themselves in reading and thinking and meditating on the Old Testament scriptures and can make the connections without being told as explicitly as Matthew does in those cases.
Yeah.
And that works out in lots of really fascinating ways. Like so many examples, but take Mark 1, for example, where Jesus is confronted. Somebody comes to him and says, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." And you think, oh, so Jesus heals the man, sends him to the priests and the temple. And that's kind of at the end of the episode. You think, okay, Mark is saying Jesus can heal people. And you think, okay, he is saying that. And yet, as you think about that, you think, oh, there's a whole lot more going on in there. As this man comes to Jesus with a disease that I think maybe somewhat unhelpfully, he's translated as leprosy, kind of modern day Hansen's disease. You think, oh, it's probably not that. But it's the disease that Leviticus 13 and 14 talks about. A disease that is significant not because it's life-threatening, but because it defiles a person, makes them impure. And it's impure means that they are separated, in this case, from other people in society, but also from temple worship. And so this man comes to Jesus asking to be made pure, to be cleansed, rather than to be healed. And yet Jesus heals him, but then still sends him to the priest to perform the ritual purification that's required in order to restore him to the worshiping community of Israel. And yet, fascinating, again, read against Leviticus 13:14, which spends a long time kind of diagnosing the disease. Kind of here's a whole long chapter, here's all the various symptoms. And then a long chapter saying, or here's what needs to happen when the disease is gone. Here's kind of the rituals that need to happen, but says nothing about how you actually heal a person. And presumably it's just left there as a gap. Oh, God must be the one who has to heal. Right. And yet here in Mark's portrayal of Jesus, Jesus comes and does the thing that nobody in Israel could do, to heal this disease, but also to overcome the source of impurity itself. And you think, oh, that Mark is saying something really significant about who Jesus is. And yes, healing is part of that, but that's kind of at the surface level. Against that backdrop of the Old Testament, there's a much richer picture that's beginning to emerge about who Jesus is and what he is doing in the world to make people fit to stand before the presence of a holy God. And it's all over in like 5 or 6 verses. It's a really short
Right.
episode, and you think, oh, but it's just saturated with all of this stuff from the Old Testament that just makes that picture in the Gospels just so rich
Yeah.
and so
Wow.
deep. And he keeps on doing it, kind of chapter after chapter, all the way through Mark's Gospel. He does the same thing, and all the other writers are doing the same.
Beautiful, man. It's we're digging. I love it.
Yeah.
I love opening these lenses for people myself, because I never even put the two together in regards to the root of the uncleanness aspect. That's wow, that's great. Now, one of the things when you read through the Old Testament too is some of these passages that are like, so again, you get a lot of these questions. Well, what is for us today? What is not? Should I cut the hairs on the side of my head? Do I eat fruit that grows from somebody else's yard? Is there but and do I obviously, do not kill, do not murder, do not take the Lord's name in vain. So, some of these passages of the Old Testament feel very time bound, right? They feel very connected to the time, while others feel timeless. How can we discern the difference between what was fulfilled in Christ and what continues to speak directly into our lives today?
Yeah, and in some ways, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? And I sometimes say to students that question that you're asking is probably the most difficult question in theology, but also one of the most important.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah.
kind of occupied Christian thought for the last 2,000 years. It occupied kind of Jewish thinking even before that. Like, how do we understand all of these things and their ongoing relevance? And maybe all of that is to say there's no simple answer. Sometimes
Right.
people kind of suggest that there's a simple answer, or you can divide the laws, for example, into these different categories, and that makes it all easy and makes the problem go away. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Some of the categories, right, was like the moral, the ceremonial, and then,
Civil and the
yeah,
civil,
those.
yeah. So it'd be great if that worked. It just doesn't
Right.
work,
Right.
because how do you assign different laws to different categories, and who gets to choose which law falls into which category becomes the big question.
Yeah.
And often people are choosing laws to fit into civil or ceremonial, because in some ways it suits them if they do, because then they don't need to think about them. And you think, oh,
Right.
I'm not sure that's the best way to go about that. And certainly when you look at both the Old Testament and the New Testament, they both consider the law as a whole. And if you think about it, the Pentateuch as a whole includes both the rules and the laws, but also the stories that are interwoven with them, along
Yeah.
with the songs and genealogies. The whole thing comes as a package, as
Yeah.
God's instruction for his people. And so I think much better, I think, to approach that from kind of Paul's point of view when he talks about scripture being God breathed and useful. You think, well, when Paul's writing that to Timothy, he's not talking about the New Testament, because there wasn't a New Testament. He's talking about the Old Testament scriptures. And so if we bring that, say, to the issue of Old Testament law or Torah or Pentateuch, and start with that as our working assumption, this is God breathed and this is useful. So let's look for the use and the value and God's eternal kind of living word, rather than looking for bits of it we can ditch.
Right.
It's just a better approach, I think. That still
Yeah.
doesn't answer all the questions or remove all the difficulties, but I think it puts us in a different starting place as interpreters.
Right.
That we're trying to discern, okay, how do we work out what God is saying and not saying here? And if we think about it, the issue is exactly the same in the New Testament. So like multiple times kind of Paul will conclude a letter saying, greet one another with a holy kiss. You think, oh, here's an imperative from an apostle in the New Testament. And you think, I'm still waiting for my first holy kiss. I've visited lots of churches in lots of different countries all around the world. I'm still waiting for that. And you think, oh, why did we not obey what Paul has clearly said? You think, oh,
Right.
because it's not as simple as that. There's kind of contextual factors and historical factors, and there's cultural things going
Sure.
on, and he's saying that for a particular reason. And you think, okay, well, if we apply the same sort of logic and kind of digging into what Old Testament laws are actually trying to do, then we might come up with more sensible results.
It's good. That's an interesting way to look at it, right? Because I feel like we can, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like we can remove some where it's clearly cultural for a season, but others, you're right, it is a bit harder to sit there and go, like this could be useful or not. But again, then again, this is where you're talking about the $64,000
Yeah,
question, right? Like
yeah,
the cutting on the sides of the head.
yeah.
I'm in New York, right up the road, right, half hour
Yeah,
away.
yeah,
I got a whole entire
yeah,
county over here of Jewish people that cut that, and they believe it's useful because they're honoring God for that way,
yeah,
in that way. So it's
yeah.
definitely. I don't know if you want to try cracking this nut here in our 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah. I'll say a couple more things. It's not going to crack the nut, but a couple of things that might be useful and for your listeners as well. I think one of the values of, like, there's lots of values in archaeology. I think one of the fascinating things, as we've discovered across the last century or so, a bunch of kind of ancient world law codes, codes like laws of Hammurabi and lots of different things that we've kind of dug up and translated. And you think, oh, that gives us a really helpful understanding of how these sorts of texts functioned in the ancient world. And primarily what they're doing is to paint a picture of the lawgiver. And so again, with the laws of Hammurabi, the whole ideal behind these laws is to say what a great king Hammurabi was, kind of 18th century Babylonian king. Oh, what a wonderful king he is! Look how just his rules are. Look how gracious he is to people. Look at what wisdom he obviously conveys. You think, okay, so that's what's going on there, and you think, oh, the Old Testament law, I think at a really high level, is doing something very similar. It's saying, oh, look at the portrait of Israel's God. Look how wise and just and caring and loving he is, and how he expects his people to follow suit. And so again, kind of having that high level understanding, think, oh, that's helpful. I can look for that. I can look for what this is saying about God and who he is and what he expects from his people. And so maybe coupling that then with kind of what Jesus does when he says, I kind of, what's the most important part of this? And it's kind of, well, loving God with all of your heart and soul and mind. That's the most important command. And then loving your neighbors yourself. And you go, here are two really good questions to bring to whatever part of the Torah we might be in, and think, okay, well, how is this helping us to understand who God is, kind of that high level thing, but then how is this a possible expression of loving God? And or how is this a way to love one's neighbor? I think if I can grapple with those things and work out those, then I can sense something of what God was saying to his people. Yes, in a particular time and place, with all the kind of the cultural things that come with that. But from that, I can then discern, oh, this is God's way of acting in the world. And I can begin to work out, okay, well, how does that actually land for me in my context, in Sydney or down the road to New York or wherever we happen to find ourselves? You think, oh, that gives us some really fruitful stuff to think about and to wrestle with.
Yeah. And we could do, probably all of us, a better job at nailing those two down, of loving God and loving our neighbors,
Yeah.
just as a whole.
Yeah. I don't think we ever graduate from either of those lessons. They're just kind
Yeah,
of
right.
just lifelong lessons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you share what you did share one? I don't know if you have any more. If you could share an example from the Pentateuch where a passage or theme comes alive when viewed through the lens of fulfillment in Christ.
Yeah, like again, so many examples. Like I've been preaching at our own church here just through Leviticus recently. And so we were at chapter 16 a little while ago, Day of Atonement, well-known passage. And yet just kind of having worked through that, then looking at the book of Hebrews and the way that Hebrews 9 and 10, right at the climax of the book of Hebrews, just draws extensively on the Day of Atonement. Like here's this day in Israel's sacrificial system that was kind of climactic, the most important day of the year, as a means of cleansing the people, of cleansing the tabernacle itself, cleansing the altar, kind of like a national reset point. And yet, from the point of view of the Old Testament, still limited. Yes, effective, able to do real things. It's not just there as a charade or as a symbol of something. No, it's actually doing something. But even in the Old Testament, that what it could do is limited. And one of those kind of limitations is it cannot ultimately transform people. And so the reason why the sacrifices need to keep on being offered, as Hebrews says, is because the people kept sinning. Yes, it was a means of dealing with that, but the people kept on doing it. And so there's kind of endless cycle of going through that. But the author of Hebrews just picks up on all of that language to portray Jesus as a high priest. who enters not just the earthly tabernacle, but the heavenly tabernacle itself with a better sacrifice to perform a better transformation of people, kind of what the Old Testament is longing for, that ultimate transformation of people so that they will no longer sin. And so kind of the author of Hebrews has bracketed that whole section with kind of quoting from Jeremiah, that promise of the new covenant and the transformation of the human heart. And you think, oh, that just makes so much sense. And so it's kind of, in understanding that, it's not that Jesus has come to do something entirely different or at a tangent from that, but Jesus brings that through to its fullest and final completion. And then kind of Hebrews moves to the openness that we all now have to enter the heavenly most holy place. You think, oh, that's just so poignant when you've just spent time reading Leviticus 16 about, like, it's a wonderful moment, but it's the high priest only, and only once a year. And you think, oh, there's access, but it's limited. When will it be for everyone? And Hebrews is saying, well, now, through what Jesus has done on our behalf as high priest, now a new way opened for all to come. It's just incredible.
Yeah.
And so I think every time I've preached that passage, I've preached it at lots of times, different places. As you look around the room, you see tears.
Yeah.
You think, oh, just because it's so moving, what God has done to overcome the full extent of our problem. A problem we've inherited, a problem we've contributed to across lots of different dimensions. God has acted on our behalf to do everything in order to bring us to himself. It's just wonderful.
Yeah. Do you believe Paul wrote Hebrews?
I've no idea. That sounds like a New Testament question.
All right, I'll get the New Testament guy on next week to handle that one.
Yeah, I look forward to listening to that episode. Yeah, I've got no idea. I don't know.
Okay.
Yep.
So how do theological themes of the Old Testament, like covenant, law, sacrifice, kingdom, how does that help shape the way Christians live and think today?
Yeah, like all of those things just become so important for understanding not just the Old Testament, but for the way that the New Testament conceptualizes the life of the believer. And so, in a sense, the Old Testament gives us the theological grammar of all those things you're talking about: covenant, law, sacrifice, atonement, forgiveness. Like, it's all there in the Old Testament. The New Testament just picks up on that vocabulary and uses it to explain who Jesus is, and then the implications of that for God's people. Sorry?
So it lays that foundation for us.
Yeah, and shapes the Christian walk in just unique ways. And so I think of how often, say, that the story of the wilderness generation in Numbers, they're the ones who were delivered out of Egypt. They experienced the Exodus, they experienced Mount Sinai, and yet they grumbled and complained. They turned to idols. They engaged in immorality. And God said, okay, you can all die in the wilderness. I'll start again with the next generation. And yet that story just appears again and again and again through the New Testament as a way of helping Christian people now conceptualize who they are and the implications of who they are and the implications of coming into relationship with a God who is holy and just. And so, like Paul, like in 1 Corinthians 10, like we'll pick up on that whole story, and fascinatingly, writing to a Gentile church, can say, oh, here's the things that happened to our forefathers, kind of including them in that story. But then all of those items that I just mentioned, like the immorality, the idolatry, the grumbling against God, the testing of God, Paul uses these and says, here are examples that God has given us to turn us away from evil. And so it becomes a conceptual way to understand how this is the calling that Christ has for his people. Again, not in a different direction to what was there before, but in the same direction, with the same sort of parameters. The difference being that now God has poured out his Holy Spirit within us to move us to the obedience that God has always desired from his people. Which, in that sense, kind of increases the expectancy. Sometimes as you kind of talk to Christians, it's like obedience is kind of there as kind of a tag on. kind of an optional extra as kind of part of
Right.
faith for the really dedicated. And you think,
Yeah.
no, the whole movement across the scriptures is actually just increasing the expectation for obedience as new covenant believers who are filled with God's Spirit, like in the language of Ezekiel 36, being moved to be obedient. You just think, oh, the expectation is higher
Yeah.
because God is the same and yet has drawn us to himself. And whatever about having the presence of God living in the tent over there, it's an entirely different dynamic to say, oh, the presence of that holy God now lives in us as his people by his Spirit. You think, oh, you've just raised the stakes considerably.
Yeah. Standard raised higher.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all of that language that maybe on a first look you think, oh, that's kind of done away with or not really relevant, or we can kind of not bother thinking about all of that. There's actually the whole framework for understanding ourselves as God's Christian people. It's all still there and all just flows through the text of the New Testament. And so we do ourselves, I think, a disservice if we're not engaging with the Old Testament and understanding these concepts and how the New Testament writers are recycling them in order to speak to God's Christian people.
Just a few more questions here before we wrap here. If a believer wanted to start engaging the Old Testament more deeply, where would you encourage them to begin?
I think I just encourage them to begin reading it.
So right from the beginning,
Well,
open up
maybe
Genesis.
from the beginning or maybe from somewhere else. Like at one level, it doesn't matter. But I think one of the reasons that I find people struggle with the Old Testament is just because it's unfamiliar. People struggle with the book of Romans, but quite often, because they're convinced it's important for them, they'll read it again and they'll read it a third time. They'll listen to a podcast series. They'll do it in Bible study. They'll have a sermon series on it. They'll keep on pushing it. They'll stay up all night talking to their friends about predestination. They kind of engage deeply with it. And you think, oh, if
Yeah.
we just apply that same sort of thinking to the Old Testament text, so whether it's one book or the whole thing, and just read it and reread it, listen to some sermons, read a good book, find a good book on it, do it for Bible study. The more we grapple with it and wrestle with it, the more we're going to understand, and the more deeply we'll be able to engage with what it has to say. And so, my advice to them would just be do that. You can start at the beginning if you want. Start with something else. Doesn't matter. Take the book you're most unfamiliar with and spend some time doing that. Get some friends around you. Do it together. Is
Yeah.
always much better than just kind of individually struggling with the text. It doesn't
Right.
make any sense to me. Well, let's do it as a group and we can help one another grapple with this, because somebody else will see something that I don't and they'll have a way of explaining it that's helpful for me and I can do that for them. It's just a much richer experience if we do that in community
Yeah.
rather than just kind of sitting on our own in our bedroom or our kitchen or wherever we might be, kind of staring at the page going, I've no idea what's going on here.
Right. Right.
Let's do it together, because the rewards are worth it for all the reasons we've been talking about and more. It's just such tangible benefit from really deeply engaging with the text of the Old Testament.
And I like the imagery of the wrestling with the texts that are somewhat uncomfortable, or why does this say this, or why is God doing this, or allowing this, or why is this person responding this way? I think those are healthy conversations that we need to start having more.
Yeah, I think so. And the temptation is always to. I think sometimes we're afraid of hard questions and afraid of doubt.
Yeah.
And so if we have either of those, we try and hide it, pretend it's not there, certainly don't talk to anybody about it. I
Right.
think it's much more healthy to actually have those conversations. And so whether you keep a journal or a list or a spreadsheet or whatever you do, as you notice those things or as things strike you as being awkward or difficult, you think, I don't know what that means, like write them down. These are good things to talk about. They're good things to go and research or read up on, and to talk to other believers about and see how they've thought about that portrait of God or that episode and how do they think about that. And if we can have more of these conversations together and develop communities that are open to having these conversations, I think that's actually good for us all.
Yeah.
Because we all do. I've been teaching Old Testament for many, many years. I've written lots of stuff on it. I still have questions.
Sure.
Still have things you think, oh, I don't quite know what to do with that. But you got to keep coming back to them and not just kind of pretend that they're not there or sweep them under the carpet. that doesn't help us or anybody else.
Right. Right. No, good. Again, all great points. All great points. So, all right, as we close, last question here before we chat about you a little bit is, what's the one truth from your years of study that you hope every Christian would take away about the Old Testament and its connection to our faith today?
I think that probably the one thing I would say is that God is there and present in every season of life. I spent lots of time writing about Leviticus. I've also spent time thinking through and writing about the topic of lament. And you just think, it's something the Psalms make so clear, but not just the Psalms, is that God is truly present with his people in every situation of life. And again, the stories of the Old Testament feed into that. Israel's history feeds into that. That even in the midst of judgment, or even in the midst of kind of slavery, in as much as in the midst of deliverance and kind of rescue from those things, God is present and active and working. And you think that is just so wonderfully encouraging as we, in our various lives, face all different kinds of things, some expected, some completely unexpected, some that fill us with joy, some that fill us with tears. It's just such a foundation to life to know that God is with us in all of that. It's like, as Jesus says, and kind of parting words at the end of Matthew's gospel, like, surely I'm with you all the days between this day and the end of the age. And you just think, that's enough. That's enough to know that Jesus walks with us on this path, on the good days, on the bad days, and everything in between. And the Old Testament just stands as this living testimony to that reality as it played out in the lives of Israel across the centuries.
Dr. Harper, this has been an incredible discussion and really rich, and I really appreciate your wisdom and knowledge. And just this conversation, I really believe it's going to bless people. It's going to really have them think on the scriptures, meditate on them, and take them to a deeper level. It's blessed me just having this convo with you. And I really do appreciate your work, your study, and even just the way you speak it is wonderful. It's really amazing.
Yeah, no, pleasure to talk, and pleasure to be able to speak on these things.
Is there any way people could get a hold of you? You got anything coming up in the future? You got any things resources that people could pull off of?
I've got a book that came out a couple of years ago. If people want to grapple with Leviticus, so it's a book written to pastors, Bible study leaders, really written to people who are saying, I'd like to have a look, but I've no idea what's going on. So it's a book called Teaching Leviticus, Christian Focus, published that. I've got another book coming out with IVP next month, looking at the whole biblical theme of impurity.
Wow.
Across the canon, so kind of grappling with Leviticus Numbers, but also thinking, how does that play out across the Old Testament? But also, how does that shape life and faith in the New Testament? So we touched on a bit of that in the podcast, but lots more in there. So just another one of these kind of biblical themes that, again, we often kind of dismiss or think that's not really relevant.
Right.
Think, no, it's there all the way from Genesis to Revelation. It's got a whole lot to say to us if we think about it.
All right, so I'm gonna link the book in the description on the podcast to Leviticus, and when this book comes out, I'll be in touch, and hey, did this come out yet? Because that's gonna be one to take a dive into as well, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. Well, again, Dr. Harper, thank you so much for joining me this morning, your time, and really appreciate you digging in with me tonight.
Yeah, absolute pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In Podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.